and welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, the podcast where I promote progressive politics, left-wing philosophy, and critical thinking by talking to a variety of people and getting their ideas out there. Today I'm talking to Callie Wright from the podcast Queersplaining. Is that, I guess, the best way to explain it now?
That's the one.
Formerly the Atheist Manifesto, which is when I started listening. Yep. That's a long time ago now.
Yeah, God. I was actually just thinking about that the other day. I think it's been like 7 years now since I started podcasting. I'm old. It's fine.
That's awesome. It's a great hobby, actually. And I suppose
thankfully for me, it's part of how I pay the bills now with between my podcast and doing freelance work for other clients. So yeah,
that's amazing. So my show is a political show. And I wanted to talk to you kind of a bit about where you are now versus where you used to be. But first, I guess a good place is a little bit of your background for anybody who doesn't already know you.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a queer trans podcaster. Like we just said, I've been podcasting for 6 or 7 years now. And originally it was, very specifically, like I wanted to talk about LGBTQ stuff and atheist stuff, like all together, because I had some incidents, particularly when I started getting into the queer community where I live. I felt very unwelcome there as a person who wasn't religious. Which I was like really surprised and really bummed about. It was like being like actively proselytized to. And, I heard a whole lot of the things you hear about how you can only be a good person if you believe in God, or like that's the only place that you can find like comfort and solace and all of that. And, and I was, when I got into the whole thing, I noticed lots of these events happen at churches, right? And the practical reason for that is because a lot of times churches will let you use their facilities for free, right? So I try to be sympathetic to that. But I figured this is the queer community, right? Even people who are religious are at least going to be compassionate towards those of us who are not, especially those of us who are not for very deeply personal reasons, right? And I was really bummed to find that wasn't necessarily the case.
No kidding.
And then in the atheist world, even when I first started getting involved and was still really unaware of, the domination of straight white cis dudes and the covering up of shitty behavior and all, even before I was aware of any of that, just on a surface level, I was like, where are all the trans people? I know they exist. Why don't they have podcasts or YouTube channels or run nonprofits or whatever?
Yeah, for sure.
And so the TLDR version is those thoughts rolled around a whole bunch. And I was like, okay, so I want to do some kind of activism at this intersection of communities. And, at the time I was listening to a ton of podcasts, and I have an audio engineering background. I went to school to learn how to run recording studios. And so I had all of the gear and all of the know-how. And so it's it just seemed logical. I guess I'll just start a podcast. And that's,
for sure.
There's a ton of other details in there, but we'd be here for an hour if I told you the whole story.
Yeah.
But that was basically it. And I just thought wow, there's a whole lot of stories that aren't being told and a lot of perspectives that aren't being heard. And if I'm having this problem, I'm sure I'm not the only one. And so that's kind of where my entree into podcasting and activism and community building and that sort of stuff came from. And then, over time, I have grown more interested in the idea and the power of storytelling specifically, as opposed to just it started as very much a traditional interview style podcast, much like I'm sure we're going to do here, which is great. That's not I always try to take pains to say, I'm not shitting on that medium or that style. There are lots of great shows that I listen to and enjoy. But I just became more interested in the idea of I want to hear your story. I want to get to know you and where you came from and how you got to be where you are and what we can all learn from that kind of thing. And so over time, my podcasting kind of shifted more in that, as opposed to just doing a straight up interview. It's more public radio storytelling, type stuff. And then, aside from that, I am a giant Star Trek nerd. sort of an intermediate Klingon speaker. When it's not pandemic times, I play roller derby, and I like coffee and dogs a whole lot. So that's like the TLDR Callie in a nutshell.
That's perfect. I guess, thinking about your show, the way you do it with the storytelling, like that's so, like as a talking shop perspective, it's so much editing and in-depth. Like that's why I don't do that type of show, because it's so intensive.
Well, and honestly, I'm very fortunate, because I am able to do the show that way specifically because I have enough support on Patreon that I can treat it like part of my job. Right. I block out a day, sometimes 2 days of like full work day to put the show together. Cause sometimes I do monologue episodes, and those are usually half to 3/4 of a day worth of writing, and then maybe another half a day to full day of like recording and editing and mixing and stuff. Right. But the shows where I do an interview with someone else and I'm cutting it into a story, sometimes I can spend 30 or 40 hours just in the edit. For an hour to an hour and a half long interview. And it's a ton of work, but it's really creatively fulfilling. Like that's the kind of stuff that I sort of most enjoy listening to, like as a listener. Right. And it's also just really creatively fulfilling to put together and, just like pulling in all of the best parts of someone's story and really, cause most of the people that I talk to are not people who are on podcasts a lot, right? There's no media training, there's no experience, right? And so people are usually like really nervous and they like start sentences over and there's lots of flubs and that kind of stuff. And it's also like really personally fulfilling to me to be able to like take that person's story, put it into a way that's easy for other people to understand and hand it back to that person, because that's the other person saying like, oh man, like I don't think I've ever been able to tell my story that well to another person. And that's really cool for me. It's sort of a way for me to help out like the person that I'm interviewing and the folks who listen, because I feel like everyone kind of gets something out of it. And that's, there's a political aspect to that, right? Because a lot of what you hear about in the like audio making world and podcasting is extractive storytelling, right? So like, you go, you parachute into a place, you fly in on a plane, you talk to this person, you have zero idea of the cultural context they come from. Yeah. You're a cis person interviewing a trans person, a white person interviewing a black person, that kind of stuff. You have no idea where this person comes from, where their background is. And all you're thinking is, how do I get the story out of this person and put it in a way that's going to get the most clicks, the most, ad revenue, like that kind of stuff. Yeah. And, that one of the reasons I stopped being a fan of capitalism, which I'm sure we'll get into, is, obviously that's the drive, right? You want clicks and you want listens. But like what I'm interested in is like what someone's actual story is. And, the mainstream, I hate using this phrase, the mainstream media. Like what other phrase is there, right? Yeah. But like, like the major news outlets, they do such a bad job telling trans stories. And it's because, one, they're usually only, if it's focused on a trans person, they only talk to that one trans person. The reporter is a cis person with zero cultural competence. And the editors are thinking about the audience, which is not trans people. Right. And you put all of those things together and you get stories that focus only on the hardship, and they focus only on like, this person's life was miserable and they wanted to die, and then they had surgery and now life is great. And that's like the only trans narrative we ever hear. Right. Yeah. And I think that's definitely a, like, sometimes we laugh so we don't cry kind of thing, but that also like legitimately does a really bad disservice to the public discourse and the way that the broader society views trans people. And so that's what I try to do is to kind of solve that problem. Like a trans person, obviously, like I'm white, I'm middle class, so I don't have a perfect understanding of everyone's perspectives, but I do understand what the extractive storytelling model looks like, and I'm actively working to subvert that model as the right way to tell people's stories. And it's because like I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of that, and so it's really important to me that I don't do that for other people. And I think that's why people, trans folks especially, why they glom onto the show, because I don't do that kind of storytelling.
Yeah, like that's one of those things where they talk about representation in media, right? Like that's why it's important for Indigenous peoples to cover Indigenous cultural stories, or so that they're not just, you know, a white dude going into a reserve and being like, hey, look at all these people suffering from alcoholism. Must be a thing with natives, you know.
And even, you know, as a person not part of a community, to make a serious commitment to understanding that community even.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because like in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it is impossible for a cis person to tell a good trans story, right? It's just that the way media generally works is not conducive to that. Cause like, I mean, I've heard it done. I listened to, there's a show called The Cut where they did an interview with Tori Peters, the author of the book Detransition Baby. And the host of that is a cis person, but she still did a fantastic interview. And I could tell she really knew what she was talking about, right? The problem, obviously being a trans person doing trans stories, that's going to get you there, right? But what frustrates me is that I don't actually think it would be that difficult for cis people to tell good trans stories if they really, really decided they wanted to. Like, because all you got to do is just like do the reading, do the work, get to know people, talk to people. It's like, it's not even really that hard. And I think that's part of the reason it's part of what's so frustrating for me. It's like, we're not this like complicated lockbox that you can't get into, right? Like so many of us are just sitting here waiting for people to be like, hey, can I talk to you about a thing? And so many people are just like not interested in doing that. It's very frustrating.
It's interesting actually, because there always seems to be the motivation for them to like embed themselves with QAnon or white nationalists. You'll see these in-depth like docuseries about these people that, okay, so you got to know them and you figured out their backstory and you did all the research. And why can't you do that with marginalized groups?
Right. And that's a fantastic question. And I think, I don't know, that's a very, very multifaceted answer to that question. And I'm not an expert in journalism. I didn't go to school or anything, but like I have a lot of journalist friends. I have a lot of trans journalist friends, and they've spent a lot of time educating me on these problems. And yeah, I mean, that's, you know, how many articles did we see about like, oh, like we've still got to work to understand why someone voted for Trump, even though they all say the same like 5 things. You know what I mean?
We actually know why.
Yeah, like this is not some burning question that we don't have the answer to. And it's the same thing with QAnon. Like they're out there telling you exactly, they're wrong and evil and terrible, but what they are not doing is hiding their motivations.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's strange media these days. Like you say, I hate using the term mainstream media because it's so destroyed by, I guess, Trump and the right. But also, what else are they? Like that's literally
right.
What
I mean,
are.
that is that is exactly what it is. It's honestly gotten to the point where most major news outlets, when they do a trans thing, I just don't read it or pay attention to it anymore. Like I just saw, this is Caitlyn Jenner running for governor of California, which is just, I mean, first of all, doomed to fail, right? Like there's no way she's actually going to have any success in that. But like immediately people are like, prominent transgender activist Caitlyn Jenner. No, she's not. She's a lot of things. She is not a transgender activist. Like you don't even have to dislike her to say that. Like that's just not a thing she is.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's because in society. Well, and it comes back to the idea that like if you are an out trans person of any prominence, you're automatically seen as an activist. Which like even if I loved Caitlyn Jenner, I wouldn't call her an activist. That's just not a thing she does.
No, that's right.
And again, it's really easy to not fuck that up.
It's pretty basic. Even that one's really basic.
Yeah.
Okay. Kind of to shift gears a little bit. Like I say, I kind of wanted to talk to you about your change in political views. So what do you identify as politically now?
I would say I'm a leftist, and I don't know that I have a deep enough understanding of theory to apply a more specific label than that. And that's okay. I don't necessarily feel like I need to. And this is actually, I think my gender journey has informed a lot of this in saying that, like, I can tell you with like 100% certainty a whole lot of things I'm not. I'm not 100% sure I can tell you exactly what I am, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's fair.
You know, so when I first became politically aware, I think my politics as a, like, tween, teenager, late teens, early 20s, I really think my politics were just contrarian more than anything. It was just that idea that, like, well, if it's mainstream, it's probably wrong, and I'm cool enough that I figured that out. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I was definitely, I used to be, oh God, this is embarrassing. I used to be like a Family Guy edgelord kind of person. I was one of those, like, I'm not racist, but I'm not sexist, but kind of people. Not proud of having been that way, but that's where I was. And, you know, as time went on, I think I started to become more of probably like a mainstream liberal, in that, like, I recognize, like, okay, yeah, like, systemic racism is a thing. Sexism is a thing. I don't like any of that. Like, everybody should be treated equally. That's cool. Of the people I hear speaking politically, Democrats seem to be mostly on that side. So I think maybe that's where I'm at. And that was like early to mid 20s. I kind of went into that mode, and I lived there until I figured out I was trans. And this is part of the reason that I try to give people a little grace when they're coming from a fucked up place politically, is that, like, given my background, given the environment that I grew up in, I'm not 100% sure that I would have come to the place politically where I am if I wasn't trans. Because I started to learn about trans issues and the systemic issues therein. And so I would have those arguments and those conversations with people, and then I would start to see the parallels with other axes of oppression, right? And so, like, obviously transphobia and racism, for example, not the same thing. But the way people on the wrong sides of those issues argue has a lot of similarity in it. Like, there's similar themes, right? And so I would see that and think, like, oh, wait a minute, that actually sounds familiar to me. And so what I did is I joined a bunch of leftist Facebook groups, like sort of like specifically like feminist, leftist, atheist type Facebook groups. And I didn't interact much. I just kind of like looked at the discourse and saw what people were saying, and you know, blog articles people would link to and that kind of stuff. And that started to push me further and further left. And I think I was sort of until probably 2 or 3 years ago, I would have called myself maybe like a leftist pragmatist. Like in an ideal world, here's what I would want, but we have to deal with reality, so here's what we can get, kind of thing. Yeah. And then, you know, probably within the last year and a half to 2 years, I would say I've gone pretty hardcore left in terms of, like, I'm a police and prison abolitionist. I'm like 100% in favor of, like, seizing and redistributing wealth and, you know, and those sorts of things. And so, like, you know, what I know of communism appeals to me. I'm not sure that I know enough about the theory to say, like, 100% like I'm on board with that label. And I mean, also, like, communism is also a million different things, right? There's like a ton of subheadings under communism and different, you know, different ways that, you know, because communism is the ideal and the disagreement usually is how we get there, right? Exactly. Yeah. And I'm not super familiar with all of the varying theories and how that works. I would still call myself a pragmatist in that, I think it's worth fighting for ideas that seem impossible, because, like, all of the progress that we take for granted now seemed impossible at one point or another, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But what I can't forget is that, like, there are people out on the streets there right now suffering. And if I can take action that helps that even a little bit, I should still probably do that, even if it's not hashtag the revolution. Right.
Yeah.
And that's where, lots of leftist discourse leaves me behind a little bit. Because I get the sense among a lot of leftist groups that they don't feel like activism is worth doing if it's not directly contributing to the hashtag revolution, right?
Yeah.
And I can't get on board with that, right? And that's not to say that I don't think it's a good idea, and it's not something that, like, I would be happy to contribute to and help be a part of. But like I said, I live very much in the today. Like, what about today? What about tomorrow? You know, where are these people's meals going to come from tomorrow? Like, where is the roof over their head going to be tomorrow? And if we can apply pressure anywhere to make that position better in the here and now for today and for tomorrow, we should probably be doing that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, you know, whatever label that is, that's what I am.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure what exactly you want to pin that down as. That's
Right.
perfect. I just saw something the other day, or maybe it was even earlier today, where, like, there was a homeless encampment, and rather than rush these people out of their encampment, the community built tiny little houses for them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it didn't solve the overall issues, but it gave them a roof over their head that's permanent, that they can call an address, that solves a small problem and doesn't technically contribute to the hashtag revolution, right?
Right. Well, and that's, you know, and there's probably some debate to be had there, right? Because, like, there's, you know, the idea of, like, building parallel power, reducing your dependence on the state so the state eventually crumbles. You know, so the idea being that you don't need some violent revolution. You just build enough parallel power that the state becomes unnecessary and crumbles on its own. And so that's, like, the revolution that is not, like, people with AK-47s on the street gunning down the bourgeoisie, right?
Yeah,
and,
it's
like,
mutual aid networks. And
yeah, exactly. And I love that kind of stuff. And that's why, like, you know, that's why, like, I give money to, like, mutual aid food groups all the time, because I think that's, like, direct activism that's going to make people's lives better in the here and now today. And like, I'm not rich, but I'm comfortable, and I've got a little bit of extra to throw around here and there. And that's usually what I end up doing, is I just, like, find a mutual aid group that says they're struggling and just, like, send them $50 or whatever.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's stuff like that, like that. The comments underneath that article that I was looking at, there's a number of leftists who are going, well, this isn't enough. This isn't enough. This isn't enough. And I agree wholeheartedly. Right. But I also want to be able to acknowledge that this is a good thing, that we're, you know, as a community, that they got together and gave people tiny houses. Tiny's not great. You know, location might not be great, but I don't know. It seems weird to call this not enough all the time, and without ever saying, like, yeah, this is also a positive thing.
Yeah. And that's the struggle for me, right? Because we know that part of the reason progressive reforms happen is to keep the pressure just far enough away that the system maintains itself, right?
Yeah.
And that's when, and I am not an accelerationist, but in moments like that, I at least kind of understand where they're coming from. You know what I mean? Like that's never going to be a thing that I advocate, because that will entail horrific suffering and death. But, like, right. Conceptually, I get it, right? Like, the idea is that if you keep things from becoming bad enough, then we get to maintain the status quo. People keep suffering, and we still call that progress when it's really not. And, like, I can't disagree with any of that, right? Like, that is all correct. But I would feel very comfortable saying that almost every person who benefited from that would say, like, yes, this is a good thing. I'm very glad this happened. Yeah. And, like, that person's life is now better for that. And I can't write that off. That's just not a thing that I'm ever going to be able to bring myself to do. I don't, that doesn't fit in with my politics.
Yeah. It's similar, I find, to, like, there's multiple very good arguments against, like, a universal basic income. But one of those arguments is that it just placates people while the rich get richer, and we don't expropriate the means of production.
Right. Well, and also because so many models of UBI are about like very basic subsistence and survival, right?
Yeah.
It's not something that really allows people to go out and live a life. It is enough to allow people to survive. And those are two different concepts. And again, survival is a whole lot better than what a lot of people are doing right now. And so again, that's where I come back to that argument. And it just it's a really hard one for me.
So you have had, I guess you've had like one main episode on your show about socialism. Are you going to be exploring that a bit more?
Yeah, I don't know about on the show, just because that's like political education is not something that I focus so much on the show. Not that I don't think it's important. I just don't think that's what I do. I did that one episode because I thought it was an important thing for people to get primed on. Because it does, I mean, obviously like the well-being of all marginalized people is something that is informed by those sorts of politics, right? And so on a personal level, it's definitely something I'm exploring more. But like on the show, unless that is part of some larger story, I'm not sure that there will be much, if anything, more on the show about it so much.
That's understandable.
Aside from like I would love to do like an on the ground profile of an activist and like what they do and what their life is about. You know what I mean? But the profile would be more about like why this person does what they do, who they are, what they're about, than a specific, like, this is their political philosophy and this is, you know what I mean?
Right. Not an exploration of the direct philosophy, but more of the story, like you say.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I've honestly, I've thought about doing a separate thing like that because that's honestly how I learn the best. Because like reading political theory turns my brain to mush, honestly. Like I've got tons of books on my iPad and on my bookshelf about political theory. And I'm not that good at following it. But if I talk to somebody who really knows their shit, then it's really easier for me, especially because, you know, if I read something in a theory book and it doesn't make sense to me, then I have to like run to the computer and Google and read a bunch of different perspectives. But like, if I have a person sitting in front of me who I know really knows their shit, I can ask questions and I can ask for clarification and that kind of stuff. Right. And especially my buddy Will, the Star Trek communist, he's great. And I've thought about like, hey, Will, do you want to do like a weekly webcast? Because like
that'd be awesome.
Well, yeah. And my problem is like on a grand scale, I don't have a ton of extra time in my life.
Right.
So like I wouldn't really be able to do preparing. So I would literally just be like, okay, we're going to get that together at like 6 p.m. every Thursday and just like go on YouTube Live and just talk about it for a minute. Like that's what it would have to be. And I don't know that I would feel good about that because I like when I'm going to do something like that, I feel the need to prepare and like think about questions and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
The time probably isn't there.
Yeah. That's what I just, even during pandemic times. And I feel like, I don't know. I feel like a lot of us know what it's like to actually end up working more during the pandemic than before. Yeah. And that's 100% my, and like, that's not meant as like a humble bragger to be dismissive because I know a lot of people have the opposite problem and it's a very serious one. But yeah, I've actually been more busy in the last year or so than I was before.
Yeah. Like I went from working in the oil field then to doing gig work and I had to work just to make even a little bit close to what I was making in the oil field. Like the gig work hours you got to put in, you basically don't have any extra time. You said for counter propaganda, you wanted to cover the issue of trans people in sports. Because this is something that is apparently everywhere right now.
Yeah. And that's almost literally true. Like so many states have stuff either in progress or passed or like in committee. I forget the number. I want to say it was like 44 states or something wild like that. Have a bill in some stage, whether it's like in committee or like coming up for a vote or on the governor's desk or whatever. There's a whole we could probably take up another 2 or 3 hours with this topic alone. But like, I come at this from two different angles. The first being, it's just so obviously creating a problem so you can propose the solution using a group of marginalized people that the public knowledge is very small about, right? So even now at this point, I would say most people's awareness of trans stuff is the awareness that trans people exist. And that's like as far as the knowledge goes, right? And so there's just so much blank space to be filled up with information in the public consciousness about trans stuff. And as the right is wont to do, they recognize that as a chance to fearmonger and gain support by saying like, yes, these people are the enemy, these people are dangerous, and we have your solution. And that's to stop kids from getting health care, keep trans people out of sports, keep trans people out of the bathrooms, all of that sort of stuff.
Right.
And so like, to summarize, that's like the first problem is that like, this is simply not actually a problem for anyone except conceptually.
Right.
It is just factually and ethically incorrect. Completely emotionally removing myself from the context of the situation. But the second side of this is that I can't completely remove myself of the emotional context of the situation, not only because I'm trans, but also because I'm an athlete. I play roller derby. And, you know, I respect anyone's level of love or involvement for sports, whether it's their entire life or they couldn't care less. I never considered myself a person that was very into sports at all, except when I was in like middle school and early high school. And sports didn't really appeal to me. A lot of like football fans, soccer fans, basketball fans, whatever. It's what you're into. I love and respect it. I don't care about it. And I got into roller derby. Long story short, it was like, I like exercising, but I don't like exercise. And so like, if I want to keep doing that, I should probably find a sport. And, you know, the only sport that I had a hope of being welcome in was roller derby. And so I checked it out, and, like, turns out being an athlete, athleticism and team sports in the way that it works, at least in my experience, is something that has been like deeply, deeply meaningful and formative to me as a human being. And legitimately, my friend group is roller derby. I've learned a lot of self-confidence because of roller derby. You know, and that like I put on skates and hit people, right? And I really suck at this, but I'm going to try this new thing anyways. And oh my God, I figured it out. Like there's so much confidence and self-love and that can come from that. And it's turned out to mean a lot more to me than I ever thought it would. I imagined that it was like, yeah, I'll make some friends, I'll have some fun, I'll stay strong and stay in shape, and it'll be a cool hobby. And it took like no time at all for it to become one of the most important things in my life. And I think for people who want them, team sports are not just a fun thing that you do like on the weekends or whatever. It's something that is deeply important and deeply meaningful. And you learn so much about yourself and how to interact with the world. And the idea that there's such this Herculean effort to deny that, not just to adults, but to kids, right? Like, I mean, I'm an adult, a middle-class adult. So like generally I can go like have a drink at a bar instead of playing sports, and I can make friends that way, you know? But there are lots of people for whom like team sports are going to be the only way that's accessible for them. Like if you go to public school and you don't have to pay a lot of money to play the sport, like that's something that your life can really seriously suffer from being denied if it's a thing that you want. And the idea that they want to keep people out and expel people currently involved, I just think about what my life would be like if I knew I didn't have that anymore. And I mean, the pandemic has taught me that a little bit, right? Because the entire world stops. Obviously, putting on skates and hitting people isn't going to be something that you do during a pandemic. And I know how much it's gutted me to have that taken from me, even on a temporary basis, right? Like, barring something absolutely wild, I will put on skates and hit my friends again. And so like I have that knowledge. but I know how much it gutted me to have that taken away from me and not to be able to do that and not to be able to see my friends and not to be able to learn those like really important life lessons and have those amazing experiences that sports can provide. And it is absolutely, utterly heartbreaking to me to know that like there are people who are like at risk of having that denied to them I mean, some of these laws have actually been passed into law. And of course, I mean, you know, the ACLU will do their thing, but like, you know, good thing we've got the Supreme Court, right? Womp womp. And so, so I'm coming at it from an angle of like, it's just like factually wrong and silly. And also that it's like deeply personal to me and that I am a trans athlete. And the idea of that being denied just kills me. And so I guess the counter propaganda to that is to just like look at the information and listen to doctors. Like if you look at the hearings that people have been going through, so many of these politicians were asked like, okay, so like how many transgender athletes are there in your state? Well, I'm not actually like fully aware of, okay, so like how many of these problems have been reported? Well, I'm not actually, it's not a thing. It's not a problem. And if you look at the science, everybody says they follow the science and lots of people don't follow the science. But all, you know, and all that's to say as well, like what's really important to know about this is that like they're choosing to go after us in this time because we're an easy target at the moment and we're more vulnerable. But, you know, it's, you know, at first it was like, well, it's just about like keeping kids away from health concerns, which is bullshit. But they said that's all it was about. And now all of a sudden it's sports too. And then there's a bill, I forget what state it's in, that will make it illegal for insurance to cover trans stuff, even if an insurance company wants to cover trans stuff. And there was a state considering a law where they would have to put warning signs on the bathrooms to say that trans people are allowed to use these bathrooms. And then, you know, the idea is it is not going to stop wherever they say like, well, it's just about this. It's not going to stop there, right? Like they're absolutely going to come after marriage rights again. They're setting the stage for that. Yeah. And so like, if you're a queer who thinks the fight ended with marriage equality, which we don't actually have marriage equality. That's a whole other thing. Lots of disabled people can't get married because of SSI benefits. Look it up. But like, they're going to come after marriage rights. They're going to keep chipping away just like they have with abortion. So yeah, that's my very long rant.
I guess my thoughts on the trans sports issue and the transgender kind of limitations that they're trying to impose. It just seems a continuation of, like you say, a problem that doesn't actually exist. Like the first time I ever heard of a trans person in sports was on the Joe Rogan show, which is not a good place.
Yeah, nothing good happens at that place.
But he actually he actually had somebody push back against what he was saying. Like there was he had a trans person on whose name I cannot recall. And every time he would be like, yeah, but men are this way and women are this way. And they would be like, no, no, that's not right.
Well, I actually have a really funny story about that if we have time to share.
Sure.
So I'm not going to name names of anyone involved because I genuinely believe this person was asking because he didn't know. And so I don't want to like dime him out and like put him out there like I'm trying to make fun of him or tear him down or anything like that. So not naming names. And I won't even say where or when this happened. But at a convention, I was approached by someone. This was a convention in which I had a forward-facing role. I was a person on stage. And this person, seeing me in that role, said like, hey, do you know where this other speaker is? I wanted to ask them a question. And this was someone who had given a talk about trans stuff. Okay. And I happened to know who he was asking about. And I was like, no, actually, you know what? Like their plane left this morning. They had to go home, family stuff, something like that. I was like, but if you wanted to ask about trans stuff, I'm trans and like, you can ask me your questions if you want. But like, if you want to ask them specifically a question, like no sweat on that either. And so he went ahead to ask me the question, and he was asking about trans people in sports. And he did that sort of like, well, like men are like this and men are like this and men are like this. And pointing out the very obvious, like, bigger bone structure, bigger hands, a thicker skull, whatever, that kind of stuff that they say.
Right. The things they say. Yeah.
And then he turns around and he points to this person and says like, okay, but this person over here, he's pointing to this person as the sort of prototypical woman form or shape or size, and was pointing out all of the ways that, like, by his perception, this person is just like naturally at a disadvantage to someone like him. And what he apparently didn't know about this person is that this person was a trans woman that he was pointing to.
Well,
and
so that could have been a very educational moment.
And again, I'm not going to name any names at all, because I tell this story not to shame this person, but to legitimately say, like, we need to rethink what we think. But I say that to say that the person who was asking the question should have known this person was a trans woman, because they're a trans woman in a rather prominent position, where I was like, is he really pointing to, like, she's a trans woman and he doesn't know that? Like, very publicly a trans woman. And so, and I said what I've repeated here my whole time. I was like, well, let me blow your mind for a second. I'm not giving away any secrets here, but like, this person here, like, she is a trans woman. And he seemed legitimately taken aback. And I was trying really hard. Like, I'm not trying to beat you up or like do a gotcha moment kind of thing, but like, I really hope that this has been an eye opener in terms of re-examining your assumptions about people. And he really seemed thoughtful. He seemed to really take it in. And then I had occasion to excuse myself from the conversation. Yeah. A good friend of mine had walked by a few minutes before and was like, "Hey, Callie, when you get a second," and he like pointed that direction, like, "Hey, I'm going to be at my table. Come talk to me for a second." And I was like, "Yeah, cool." And I took that opportunity to be like, "Oh yeah, like, I'm going to go see what he wanted. I got to be on stage in a couple of minutes." So I had gotten that out. But he really seemed to, that seemed to be an eye-opening moment for him. And so yes, it is high time for many, many people to rethink their assumptions and biases on the topic.
Yeah. I don't know. It's one of those things, like, I have always, ever since I got into bodybuilding, actually, like back in my early 30s, I would always hear the typical standard guy thing. "Oh, that I don't think she's good looking. She looks too much like a man," type of nonsense. And I always disagreed with it. I was like, this is a person who put in all this work to build these muscles and do like this, like, even when I was like, I wasn't what they might call a woke person, but it just didn't make any sense to me that, you're limiting men and women in these various ways. And I mean, now, obviously, I don't even think that gender should be part of the discussion around sports, really.
Well, I think there are reasons for it to be a discussion, but what I will say is it's a bit lengthy, and there's no way I'd be able to recite it from memory. But the WFTDA, the Women's Flat Track Derby Association, they're the governing body for the roller derby group of leagues that I play in. They call it a gender statement that is sort of about the WFTDA's philosophy about gender inclusion. And I don't know that it's perfect, and I don't think anything ever would be, but it's about as close as I could possibly imagine to a position statement on gender in sports. And so, like, if you just literally Google the phrase WFTDA gender statement, and it'll come up, it'll be the first thing. Okay.
Yeah, no, I will even do that for everybody and put it in the show notes.
There you go. Yeah, I'm a fan.
Because, we all need to be a little bit more informed on this subject. So,
and God, my thing is, like, why wouldn't you want to be? Like, I think the political reasons are the most important in that it like has directly to do with the well-being of people. And that's always got to be at the top of the priority list.
Yeah.
But also like, how the hell boring is your life if you're not trying to understand where other people come from?
Yeah, that's right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, like, well, or even to just actually be informed on a subject that you want to have an opinion on.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Like if nothing else, just be informed on what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Okay. So where can people find your content?
Best thing to do is you can go to queersplaining.com. That's the podcast, the website where my podcast lives. But I also don't really know anyone that actually goes to podcast websites. Like almost everyone has their podcast app of choice, and you should be able to find Queersplaining in it.
Yeah. That's right.
And then other than that, I'm at Callie Gets It on Twitter. I do lots of Star Trek shit posting, lots of yelling about queer and trans stuff, and occasionally speaking in Klingon.
So is there anything you'd like to mention before we go?
No, I think we covered it. I talk a lot.
Deadly.
Sorry.
No, that's deadly. All right. Well, thank you for joining me.